All right, welcome everyone to our last in the series of presentations about algorithms and public policy. Today, we're very glad to have Peter Salib coming to talk about his work discussing the potential for big data affirmative action. So Peter is an assistant professor at the University of Houston Law Center. Prior to that, Peter was a Clemenko Fellow and lecturer on law at Harvard Law School. And after graduating from law school at NYU, Peter clerked for the Honorable Frank H. Easterbrook and practiced at Sidley Austin LLP, where he specialized in appellate litigation. So we're very happy to have Peter here today. And without further ado, I will turn the floor over to him to discuss big data affirmative action.
Thanks so much, Ryan, and thank you for having me. It doesn't matter at all. I went to UChicago for law school, not NYU, but the UChicago faculty would never forgive
Sorry
me
about that.
if I didn't credit them for all my success. And maybe it's wrong in my faculty bio for some reason, but
I don't know where I got that from. That actually was something that it wasn't in your bio, and I was thinking as I was going along that I should include where you went to law school. And so I don't know. I probably just pulled that completely wrong.
Well, we've now properly
NYU,
credited,
right?
We've now properly credited all my good or bad ideas to the Chicago faculty, and so they're on notice. So anyway, so thank you so much for having me. As Ryan said, I'm here to talk about my forthcoming paper titled "Big Data Affirmative Action," and the paper is what it sounds like. It's about affirmative action, and it's about racial inequality, and it's particularly about discrimination and what to do about it. So discrimination, in fact, remains pervasive in American life and remains an important driver of racial inequality. There are, of course, debates about this, about what drives inequality, but there's a spate of recent and extremely high quality social scientific work that in the age of randomization for causal identification does like really cool study design and asks, well, what is driving racial and other sort of disparities at various institutions and as a result of various decisions. And almost wherever you look, you find that discrimination, kind of in the traditional sense, a person being treated differently when they're otherwise identical to others, but for their membership in a protected group, a racial group, a gender group, a religious group, and so on. So discrimination remains important, but the question is what to do about it. There are, of course, laws against discrimination. So one answer is always litigation. But litigation is unfortunately likely to be extraordinarily underprotective against discrimination. There are evidentiary standards that have to be satisfied to win a discrimination case. These are often difficult, especially when many of those standards center around intent, which of course lives inside our heads and can be easier or harder to prove based on external acts that may or may not reveal, the true intent. So litigation is one answer, but it's hard to win. And by the way, litigation is expensive. So many people with small claims simply don't have a realistic access to it. Beyond that, so then what? What to do about discrimination? One set of answers, a currently quite popular set of answers, has to do with trying to get people to basically be less biased, to discriminate less. Here you can think of things like anti-bias training, diversity trainings in these big institutions. These interventions actually have their roots in social psychology literature. And of course, as we know they're quite popular, and importantly, as we'll see in a minute, legal. The problem with these is they just don't really seem to work. I think many of us are probably aware of the credibility and replicability crisis in social psychology, and anti-bias interventions, debiasing strategies seem to be a casualty of this. There are some recent meta-analyses that suggest that, well, first of all, the reported effects of these kinds of interventions are small in the first place. And once you control for publication bias by way of study power, they seem to fall effectively to zero. So one option is popular and legal policies that don't seem to work. The other option for responding to discrimination is policies that would work because they adjust outcomes directly, but which at least appear to be in serious legal jeopardy. And so here I'm talking about sort of old-fashioned affirmative action, the kind you might associate with, say, hiring quotas or school busing programs, policies under which certain benefits are sort of reserved and then doled out to people based on their membership in a certain protected group. Now, these policies go back to at least sort of the middle of the 20th century and have legal backing from the Supreme Court. However, in the last 30 years, the Supreme Court has struck down every single one of this kind of sort of old school affirmative action policy that's come before it. And here I'm holding aside campus affirmative action. We'll talk in just a little bit about how that's different and not really relevant to what we're talking about. But I'm talking here about like non-college admissions programs that dole out benefits or change treatment on the basis of race. Those have been sort of uniformly struck down in sort of a sudden turn around 1990 by the Supreme Court. Okay, so my paper proposes a sort of policy design that's supposed to navigate this dilemma, a way of trying to resolve or respond to discrimination that will work, has effect, but importantly also is legal, is not in serious jeopardy of being struck down by the courts. And I call that sort of style of policy big data affirmative action. So this is from affirmative action in that sort of old-fashioned sense we were just talking about. These are policies that would reserve some benefit and then distribute it to individuals because of their membership in a protective group, so a racial group, a gender group, religious group, etc. But unlike the sort of more old-fashioned style affirmative action policies that keep getting struck down, big data affirmative action is sort of empirically sophisticated. It's precisely targeted, and indeed could be sort of automated, algorithmically administered, that is. And the argument of the paper is that it's this precise sort of empirical sophistication that would make big data affirmative action sort of succeed under legal scrutiny, where other affirmative action policies have recently failed. Okay, so what do I have in mind? Sorry, let me get a sip of water. What do we have in mind here? So here's an example, big data affirmative action for criminal sentencing. We actually already see sort of empirical legal scholars using large data sets and statistical analysis, basically sort of regression models, to try and both identify and quantify the discriminatory penalty of race at the locus of judicial sentencing. So here I'm thinking of work by people like Crystal Yang, and also Sonia Starr and Merrick Rahavi. And essentially what these studies do is they compile these big, rich data sets on sentencing. These are data sets that reflect not only what happened sort of in the courthouse at the sort of locus of the sentencing decision, but also what happened in the sort of charging documents, also sort of layering on policing data that captures differences in arrest offense, so like differences in the sort of criminal commission that may not show up in the charging documents. And then on top of that, all kinds of demographic information, things about the, say, age or education or criminal history or arrest history of people sort of going through the criminal justice system. And so with this data, they do sort of the classic kind of econometric thing, which is they hold constant all these other non-race factors to see how much those explain the observed gross disparities in gross racial disparities in criminal sentencing, and to see whether there's a remainder. And it turns out there is. There's a remainder that does not correlate, is not explainable by these other factors, but in fact is explainable by sort of nothing else that we can think of in the model except for race. In the Yang and Rahavi or Yang and Starr and Rahavi studies, they actually converge on something like an average penalty for a Black male defendant on the basis of the race of about something like 7 months. So half a year of imprisonment because of race on average. Okay, so like once you've done this kind of analysis, the sort of big data affirmative action policy is sort of like almost implements itself, right? If you have a model that can quantify the penalty, the discriminatory penalty for, say, being a Black man in the federal criminal justice system, then the big data affirmative action remedy is to adjust the outcome by the observed penalty. So a Black defendant goes through the criminal justice process as he normally would, is sentenced to some term of imprisonment, and then on the back end, effectively automatically, his sentence is adjusted downward by the observed measured racial penalty. Okay, so would this have an effect? Well, yes, clearly, because we're imposing the effect directly, right? You know, a defendant would otherwise be in prison for X number of months, and now they're going to be in prison for X minus some big data affirmative action adjustment number of months. The question then, I think, is would this policy be legal? Would it pass legal muster where sort of similar looking policies have been sort of uniformly struck down for the past 30 years or so? So this style of affirmative action is sort of thought to originate in a case called Weber, where a steel workers union recognized that it had been discriminatory in its exclusion of Black trainees in its craft working program. And as a result of recognizing that discrimination, the union signed a collective bargaining agreement under which it held aside effectively a quota, a certain number of seats in its training program to be distributed to Black trainees, Black applicants to the trainee program until its training program no longer reflected discriminatory disparities. The Supreme Court reviewed this policy under the relevant anti-discrimination law and said, this is allowed. This is decisions on the basis of race, but it's decisions for the purpose of remedying racial discrimination, and institutions are allowed to do this. They're allowed to correct their own discrimination for exactly the kinds of reasons we talked about at the beginning. Litigation, of course, is the other kind of remedy available, but the Supreme Court recognizes many, many instances of discrimination are simply not going to be easy to prove in full-on litigation, or even if they are easy to prove, are going to be sort of too small in terms of the potential recovery to make a lawsuit viable. And so the Supreme Court says that voluntary policies by institutions worried about their own discrimination, designed to correct that discrimination, are in fact allowed. And here's where we can have a sort of brief note on campus affirmative action in admissions. Admissions affirmative action is also legal, at least for now. The Supreme Court may be about to make it illegal. But it's not really relevant to the project here because the legal foundation is different. The Supreme Court has authorized the kind of affirmative action we're talking about for the purpose of remedying discrimination, whereas the Supreme Court has authorized affirmative action in admissions for a different purpose, for promoting on-campus diversity. And so even if it turns out that that's no longer a legitimate reason to make distinctions on the basis of race or another protected class, it doesn't follow that this sort of more traditional classic kind of affirmative action that's aimed not at merely promoting diversity in the educational environment, but instead is aimed at remedying discrimination. There's not any particular reason that outlawing one should have any bearing on the other. Okay, so the Supreme Court authorizes discrimination remedying affirmative action in Weber, a union case, but then a few decades later decides a case called Wigand, also about a union, also about an affirmative action policy. Here, a policy under which Black teachers in a teachers union would be granted preferential treatment. There, the Supreme Court struck down the union's affirmative action policy. And we see these kinds of pairs across time in a bunch of contexts. So there's the Fullalove case, where the Supreme Court authorized federal spending set-asides to be distributed to minority-owned contractors. But then later, there's the Croson case, where where the Supreme Court struck down spending set-asides for minority-owned contractors. There's the Swan case, where the Supreme Court upheld an affirmative action program under which white students would be, under which non-white students would be bused to historically white schools. And then there's Parents Involved, in which the Supreme Court recently struck down an affirmative action policy under which non-white students would be bused to majority white schools. There's Paradise and Johnson, which allowed sort of the overriding of certain kinds of test scores as reasons to hire or not hire people. Supreme Court allows that. And then there's Ricci, in which the Supreme Court strikes down a fire department's ignoring of an aptitude test for consideration in promotion in the fire department. So the question is, like, what's going on here? I mean, if it turns out that what's going on is the Supreme Court is sort of secretly or sub silentio overruled the validity of discrimination remedying affirmative action, then of course, big data affirmative action isn't going to fare any better. But I argue in the paper that there's a different explanation, which in my view is more satisfying. For one thing, the Supreme Court not only hasn't struck down those cases or overturned those cases upholding affirmative action policies, it has continued to insist that they remain good law, even as it strikes down particular policies for it. What the Supreme Court insists on is that discrimination remedying affirmative action is still allowed, so long as it complies with the legal test, which has been the test from the beginning. The court calls this the strong basis in evidence requirement, and it has essentially two elements. The first element is that the institution implementing the affirmative action policy has to sort of assemble a quote unquote strong basis in empirical evidence that the institution itself has in fact discriminated, right? If you're going to remedy discrimination, the court says you have to show you've discriminated. The second element is a sort of tailoring element. Even if it turns out you've discriminated to some extent, your affirmative action policy has to not go beyond correcting context. I suggested that big data affirmative action would control for example, differences in criminal history. Now you could sort of straightforwardly object, well, those are discriminatory too. If the police or prosecutors have racial bias, then the decision in the past to charge or not charge will have been discriminatory, and so those differences reflect discrimination just as much as the judge's different treatment of the defendants before him or her. But one of these things is discrimination by the judge, and another might be discrimination by the police. And under the strong basis and evidence test, the idea is that each institution can do affirmative action to sort of clean up its own mess, to correct its own discrimination, but not another institution's. And indeed, we see that this distinction can help explain these cases that come out sort of in opposite ways, despite looking the same. For example, in Fullalove, the Congress, before setting aside spending for minority-owned contractors, engaged in a bunch of empirics about its own conduct, the federal government's own conduct in granting federal contracts in the past, and it found discrimination. This went into the behavior of the agency officials tasked with this project, and it found that the federal government had in fact discriminated, and the set-asides the Supreme Court held were sufficiently tailored to remedying just that discrimination. By contrast, in the Croson case, the city of Richmond, before it implemented a set-aside program, did none of its own homework. It effectively just relied, in fact, on the studies that Congress had done on federal discrimination against minority-owned contractors. It said, look, we know there's discrimination because Congress found it, and the Supreme Court said, well, yeah, that was federal discrimination by the federal government. If you, the city of Richmond, want to implement an affirmative action program, you can do so only to correct discrimination by the city of Richmond. I think this pattern holds for these other pairs of cases too. I won't go through every single one. Okay, so if that's the test, and if that explains these distinctions between cases where affirmative action has been upheld and struck down, well, how should big data affirmative action fare? And I think the answer is pretty well. I mean, the whole idea of these studies is that, of these statistical analyses, is that we have rich data that allows us to disaggregate different potential sources of disparity. So insofar as, for example, differences in, say, education are helping to drive differences in criminal sentencing, that may be wise or unwise, but it's not illegal discrimination. A big data analysis that controls for education helps to isolate just the racial penalty imposed by the institution implementing the policy, that is the court system at issue. So this kind of analysis can, first of all, identify the presence of discriminatory harm, and of course, quantify it as well, to say not just did this court or this business or this school, etc., discriminate, but how much? And how much part is important for the second element of the strong basis and evidence test, that is the tailoring element. You're only supposed to correct for your own discrimination. And of course, big data affirmative action is designed to do exactly that, to adjust outcomes ex post, but only by the observed, measured, expected harm of discrimination in any given case. So the argument is big data affirmative action should pass legal muster, even though policies that look like it in some ways have for 30 years been sort of continuously rejected by the Supreme Court. I wrap up the paper thinking about some other kinds of objections, the sort of normative objections that don't sound in legality. Well, one thing I consider is whether big data affirmative action is really promising as part of the solution to discrimination, or whether it's, so to speak, too weak of a medicine for the disease we have. And it's true that any given big data affirmative action policy would make adjustments that were almost certainly much smaller than observed gross differences. So I mentioned the sort of sentencing studies that show a sort of average of a 7-month penalty imposed because of race at the juncture of criminal sentencing. That's much smaller than gross observed racial disparities in criminal sentencing. And so a big data affirmative action policy for sentencing would correct only part of the disparity. But of course, there doesn't need to be just one big data affirmative action policy in sort of the criminal justice system or in society as a whole. If part of the disparity, a big part of the disparity, say, in sentencing is driven by differences in, say, criminal history, well, it might turn out that differences in criminal history also reflect discrimination, either by the police or by prosecutors in their charging decisions. And so a big data affirmative action policy for policing or for charging decisions would help to correct those disparities too, albeit at the locus of policing or charging, which sort of in compounded effect would much more substantially reduce the gross disparities observed at sentencing. You can go back even further. You could assume that maybe differences in access to education, discriminatory differences in access, could drive, say, rates of crime by people with different economic opportunities. Well, big data affirmative action policies for education could help close that gap as well, and so on and so on. So the question, how strong a remedy is big data affirmative action, I think is answered by asking, well, how broadly will it be implemented? How many institutions? You could ask a related question to this, I think. Well, like how many institutions could practicably implement this? There, I think the answer is lots. After all, we live in the era of data. Every decision, effectively, especially decisions taken by large institutions, whether they're governments, universities, businesses, leaves a big data trail. And not only that, but data can be linked in ways. Data sets can be linked in ways that were never before possible. Linked data sets actually undergird those sentencing studies in the first instance. So we live in the era of rich data, and the more data we have, the more big data affirmative action we can do. The last set of normative objections I consider are sort of the classic conservative critiques of affirmative action broadly. This is sort of the idea that affirmative action is in some sense reverse racism, quote unquote, and therefore it should be rejected. There's sort of two flavors of this objection. One is this argument that affirmative action, in fact, harms rather than helps the people who are supposed to benefit from it, because when someone receives the benefit under affirmative action, it'll be inferred by their peers that they sort of don't deserve the success they have. Irrespective of the force of that argument in other contexts for other kinds of affirmative action policies, I just don't think it holds much water for big data affirmative action. I mean, again, the whole point of big data affirmative action is to try and identify and quantify the amount by which a person would have been treated worse, unjustly worse, because of their race or gender or other protected class. And so this is really a measure of like how much they are unfairly denied that they in fact deserved. So giving them a benefit under a big data affirmative action policy isn't the bestowing of a benefit that is unearned, but in fact, it's the bestowing of a benefit that is earned, that would otherwise have been unjustly denied. The second kind of flavor of the reverse racism critique is you could take Chief Justice Roberts' dictum that the best way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. And this is the idea that just making decisions on the basis of race or another immutable characteristic is just wrong, no matter the reason. And again, I just don't think that applies with much force to big data affirmative action. Because again, big data affirmative action is a remedy for what would otherwise be a race-based or gender-based or other-based harm. So when, someone's being sort of illegally mistreated because of their membership in one of these classes, well, of course, a remedy for that mistreatment is going to also be distributed on the basis of race or gender, et cetera. Remedies match the harm. That's just how they work. And so I don't think it would be fair to say that, say, damages for in a Title VII lawsuit because you've been racially discriminated against are a good candidate for the John Roberts dictum, that these are somehow morally impermissible decisions on the basis of race. They're just remedies that flow to people who were harmed on the basis of race. And so with that, I think I'm about at 30 minutes, which is what I think I told Ryan I would stick to. And I want to make sure there's time for plenty of questions. So again, thank you so much for having me. And I'll look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. And if people have questions, you can go ahead